Welcome to The B Word, a women's lifestyle podcast. I'm your host, Katie Ploss. I'm a school psychologist, women's wellness coach, a doula, and the founder of BU, a women's wellness community. I created The B Word to share my stories, knowledge, and training to help you navigate the everyday challenges of being a woman. We discuss everything from navigating dating and relationships, parenting, building a career, to just finding what you're passionate about and figure out who you are meant to be. At The B Word, we aim to destigmatize mental health challenges, grow, heal, and empower you to be your most authentic self. Let's dive into today's episode. Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of The B Word. I am back this week with a solo epi, and I am excited that we're already in episode 6 of the third season. I have continued to get really great feedback from all of you that have been listening, and this season is definitely a different vibe, as many of you have also said, but in a good way, in a positive way. It's getting you to think. I love the conversations I have been having with all of you this season. We're going deep. We're talking conceptually about life and the way we look at things and the way we view ourselves. And that's exactly what I wanted this season to be. So I just love all of the dialogue that all of our first 5 episodes of the season has brought about. I got probably I wouldn't say the most feedback, but I got a decent amount of feedback from our episode last week. Episode 5, if you haven't listened to it, we had a guest, Carla Levitt, and she shared her story about her IVF experience failing and her infertility story. And it was an awesome episode. I got a lot of positive feedback from it, and a lot of you, I think, are hungry to dig in more about parenting and becoming a parent and thinking of yourself as a parent, and also thinking of yourself. If you're not having kids or you don't want to have children, this episode will still apply to you because you also had parents that impacted the way that you function in the world. So that is what today's episode I'm going to cover. Also, I think this is fresh and prevalent in my brain because this is a concept that I am revisiting right now. This is a concept that I learned way back probably 12 years ago when I started my bachelor's degree in child development and learned about parenting and child rearing for my undergrad degree. And now I'm going into this season of being 30, and so many of my friends are now becoming parents themselves. And also, even if a lot of my friends that aren't becoming parents are also doing a lot of reconciling their youth and how that has shaped them today and how their relationships with their own parents have evolved. And so whether you're on the side of I don't want kids, this episode invites you to reflect on your own relationship with your parents. And if you are someone that does want children, I think this episode is really great to anyone that either is a parent or aspires to become a parent, because it helps you understand the different approaches to parenting and how that could potentially impact your child, and gives you a sense of what the research has said about parenting. So let's dive in. I have always been such a nerd about child development. That's why I got my degree in it. And there's so many interesting theories, psychological theories. I really definitely could have an entire podcast dedicated to all of the theoretical greats of the past, 50, 60 years in psychology that have developed these theories that have really shaped the way that we support children and families now, and in the way that we think about our own self-development. And I think a lot of these theories really help us make sense of ourselves. And here at the B Word, that's really our goal, is to become our most authentic self. Every episode I do is going to come back to, how do you continue to walk a path that brings you to your most authentic identity. And I think it goes without saying that our parents and the way that we were raised shapes us, shapes our identity. And this research about parenting styles came out in the 60s. Today, we're going to be covering Diana Baumrind's parenting styles theory. And as I'm explaining her theory, I want you to reflect on what kind of parenting style you were raised with, what kind of parenting style aligns most with your current values, and if you are planning on becoming a parent or are a parent, what parenting style do you think is the most beneficial to use with your children or future children? So Diana Baumrind developed this theory. I am going to also say, for anyone that's listening to this that has a background in research or psychology, that this is a little bit of a controversial theory now. And it originally started in 1966. And I believe the update that was made was in like 1992. Between 30 and 60 years old, you have to take this with the lens of we're looking at a big picture framework. And that's why I am sharing it with you today, because I think it's relevant in the sense of that it helps us make sense of ourselves. It helps us make sense of just general approaches to parenting that can really shape our identities for the good or the negative. Critics of this theory say that it's not possible to put people perfectly into a box, and this could be very situational of what parenting style you show up with. I'm not going to negate that. I think that's possible. I still think it's a relevant theory anyway. The other thing too, though, most of the research was done with Caucasian middle-class American people. So the sample is skewed into like what would be most effective based on this cultural group. And I do think that's really relevant to bring up, is that when I'm going through these parenting styles, I don't really necessarily want you to assign like good or bad. I think you're going to easily develop an opinion about each of them, but I want to broaden your mindset in the sense of there might be other cultures like African American or Asian or Latino, etc., that may have a different approach to parenting that may shape your experience if you identify in one of those race or ethnicities. And that's fine. I don't think we need to assign what's good or bad. I think it's just identifying what is and how that shaped you. Simple as that. So try to keep it open-minded as possible when I'm going through this. And I'll also be prompting you with some reflection questions and how you can use these theories to ask yourself questions and reflect on how you were raised and how you were parented. Diana Baumrind has, like I said, 4 types of parenting that she categorized and identified after a series of many studies. The first type is authoritative parenting style. The second type is authoritarian parenting style. And then the third type, she started out with 3 types, and that's when I said she updated it to breaking it down into 4. She broke down permissive parenting style, the third type, into 2 types. So there's permissive indulgent, and then there's permissive neglectful parenting to make up the 4 types. So we have authoritative, authoritarian, permissive indulgent, and permissive neglectful. Authoritative and authoritarian sound very similar, but they're actually very different. And the way that she defined the parenting types and how she categorized them is she rated the parenting types based on the amount of warmth that the parent demonstrated toward their child. So warmth in like terms of affection, like physical affection, emotional affection, verbal affection, etc. And then the level of warmth, whether it was low or high, and then also the level of control. So high control or low control of the child's behavior. So for authoritative parenting, for example, that parenting style is high control and high warmth. So lots of physical and verbal affection, encouragement, connection, relationship building, and very clear cut and a high amount of boundaries and rules that children are expected to follow. Authoritarian, I usually remember authoritarian versus authoritative because authoritarian, I think of the military, which helps me. Sorry that is insensitive to anyone, but that just helps me remember, like, it's like military style parenting in the sense that it's low warmth and high control. So obviously, like, less affection and lots of rules. Do as I say and don't ask questions. Get in line. You're a child. Follow along. Do as you're told. Point blank, period. We don't need to explain. Whereas, like, authoritative has that high level of warmth. So authoritative parents really make a point to explain why their parenting rules apply and why these boundaries are there and how it's helpful for the child, and they really explain and help the child understand what the boundaries are. Authoritative, high warmth, high control. Authoritarian, high control, low warmth. Then we have the permissive parenting. The permissive parenting is divided up into two different sections, categories, I should say. Indulgent and neglectful. So the indulgent parenting style, permissive, is high warmth and low control. The term speaks for itself. Permissive indulgent parents are indulgent. They don't have strong control on their child's behavior. You might see higher levels of manipulation from the parent to try to control their child. So making statements like, oh, if you must not love me if you don't follow my rules. They usually take a great amount of care in their child's life. So they're pretty involved with their social circles, with their school activities, etc. But the child kind of runs the show, so to speak. And then permissive, neglectful parenting is low warmth and low control. So again, it's neglectful. They don't really have a lot of involvement in their child's day-to-day life. They really expect their child to be like a mini adult and self-sufficient as possible. And there's just a low amount of opportunities for engagement and relationship building. So when I describe that, obviously the indulgent and neglectful parenting, their main difference is the level of warmth in those relationships. One is low and one is high. And I think that's a really important distinction to make of permissive parents, because the permissive indulgent parent demonstrates a very different parenting style than the permissive neglectful parent. So now that you know what they all are, let's link back to some of the things I've said so that they make more sense. So culture, society, and sometimes race and or ethnicity can play a role in what parenting style your parent may have parented you with. There's research to say that more like Asian parents, for example, gravitate toward an authoritarian parenting style that is higher in warmth than, for example, the authoritarian styles preferred by the research shows African American parents. So usually African American parents, the research shows they generally have the authoritarian style of parenting, and that is culturally the norm. And the rate of warmth is usually lower than Asian parents. It's not to say that they're not as nice parents. It's the definition of warmth is in this particular type of theory, is very theoretical. So I think a lot of people have a hard time understanding, like, I'm not saying that Black parents are not warm, and I'm not saying that Asian parents are warmer necessarily in the sense of, like, they're nicer to their kids. It's just that it's how we could observe their behavior and the way that they interact with their children. So it's like very scientific and objective versus the subjective way we typically interpret warmth. It gets a little confusing. So I understand if you're still confused. But what's important to know is that different cultures tend to gravitate toward different parenting styles. For example, this research was done mostly on white middle-class Americans, like I said. And for the most part, white middle-class Americans typically gravitate, the research showed, toward authoritative parenting, high warmth, high control. And every parenting style occurs in every race. It's not like we cannot put everyone into a box perfectly, like the critics of this theory say. But I think it's relevant because whether that part is right or wrong of this theory, it can help us answer questions and reflect about ourselves and how we may have been parented. The other thing that I think the research doesn't really say much about too is the norm of the time. And I personally think that is a really important distinction to make. And for example, my parents, if I had to guess based on what they have shared with me about their childhood, they had very warm relationships with their parents as they got older. I've said on the podcast, like, I was very close with my grandparents when they were alive. However, my parents talk about often when they were younger, their relationship with their parents was very different. And they might put their parent, like categorize their parents' parenting style in the permissive neglectful, in that my parents they weren't like free range kids, but we talk about that was the norm of the 50s and the 60s, of like kids had a lot more independence then because that was the norm and what was expected. And so versus today, right? And like how much more involved parents are and how much we know about child development and the needs of children. I think also just like culture in the sense of the time and the decade that we're in, the generation that we're in, really does play a role in parenting styles too. I think that's really important to acknowledge here, is that it's not necessarily just the temperament of your parent or like the values of your individual parent or your family or your race or any other part of their identity, but also a factor is when they were raising their kids and what life was like then. Some questions to reflect on your own parenting, and I'm going to go through them and I'm going to ask you them, and then I'll share my reflections just to help prompt you and try to identify roughly what parenting style you were raised with. So, family rules. For me, rules in my family were much more authoritative in that it wasn't very specific, but there were very like pretty clear-cut expectations of how we were to interact with one another. I didn't have a ton of chores as a kid. I didn't have that authoritarian, like military style of life where I was expected to be in line all the time. Like, we definitely were goofy and silly and had that high level of warmth. But I definitely knew like there were lines that I would not cross. There were things I could not say. There were behaviors I could not do both in private and in public, that if I crossed a line, like that was the line and I was going to get it. And rarely was that physical discipline, but sometimes there was. So I would say my parents definitely authoritative in family rules of style of parenting and their discipline. As far as punishment and rewards, I would say as we were younger, spanking was rare. I can maybe recall getting spanked maybe less than 5 times. There was other little things like my dad would like pinch or whatever to like, he still to this day says that was to get our attention, and we laugh. But yeah, like little things like that, like there was definitely that more high level of control. Like my parents, we were very well behaved children for the most part, but my brothers and I, but definitely the types of punishment where if we really crossed the line, there was some physical redirection. We would also have those timeouts. We would have privileges taken away, being grounded. And those things continued, like having privileges taken away and things up until I was like 18. So I think my parents were really active in making and regulating our behavior and responding to our behavior if it was out of line. And I definitely was out of line as a teenager. So my parents were very heavily involved in regulating that. Decision-making power in the family, I also would say was authoritative, leaning toward authoritarian though, in that a lot of the quote unquote like arguments came down to it really didn't matter what I thought or said, you default to the adult. And for no other reason than they are the adult and they just know. So that is a little bit more authoritarian, right? That high level of control and that low level of warmth. Like there wasn't a ton of conversation about making me understand like why this was important. And if there was and I didn't understand it the first or second or third time, like it was just like the hammer was brought down and this is the law and you will follow it. Definitely leans a little bit authoritarian for that. So that decision-making power in the family, giving me the autonomy. However, I will also say, and going back toward that authoritative style, is that in areas that I wasn't struggling, like for example, school, I had a lot of autonomy. Like my parents didn't really micromanage me in areas that I demonstrated the capability to be independent and make the right decisions. Like I stayed on top of my homework. I followed through. I asked for help if I needed it. I communicated if I needed anything. And my parents very rarely had to worry about me with my academics. So I had a lot of autonomy. Like they weren't like, you're going to do homework at this time. Let me check in with all your assignments. They really let me figure that out. Whereas like my older brother struggled more with that. And so they were way more involved with that. So that would be more authoritative, right? Methods to deal with conflict. Again, I think this kind of goes to what I was saying earlier. So methods to deal with conflict was at the end of the day, we're going to defer to the adults, and that would be more authoritarian. Family communication styles. To think about this, I would say that my parents were relatively warm and affectionate. So again, authoritative for that. Definitely not indulgent, though. Very authoritative. Affection and nurturing practices, I just said, very affectionate. Lots of cuddles, lots of hugs, lots of I love yous, lots of warmth in our home. So again, authoritative. Family rituals and routines, very authoritative. Like my mom was very routine oriented in a way that kept the household moving. And to this day, my dad will be like, I just can't even, I couldn't even believe like how dependent on the routine your mom was when you guys were little. Really, to this day, my mom is still pretty routine oriented. I'm laughing because everyone that knows my mom knows, like, you do not interrupt her morning routine. And that was the case. And I think this developed when she had young children. And she was really good with that. That also, though, translated to other things. Like every Sunday, we would have dinner together and we would do our highs and lows of the week. So my dad would have us go around the table and rate the highlight and the low light of your week. And you had to explain why. And there were rules with it. You were required to have a high. You were not required to share a low if you didn't have one. I loved this. My older brother absolutely detested this. But the great part is that now that he's an adult, he insists that we do this at the majority of family gatherings. We would also do this after vacation. So this is very authoritative. The highs and lows, that was like a huge component of our family communications and rituals and routines. Yeah, a lot of routines that fostered communication, organization, being goal-driven, being forward-thinking, and also being reflective. So that's very authoritative. Family involvement in school. Yeah, my parents were very involved in my schooling. In the sense of I had a lot of autonomy, like I was saying, but if there was a parent event or something that they had to do with school, someone always showed up. They were probably most involved with my older brother, just because my older brother had more needs when he was younger. But really overall, if there was any type of volunteering, my dad did a lot of coaching for sports and things. Yeah, my family was very involved. Again, very authoritative. They gave us kind of the independence where we demonstrated the ability to handle our own stuff, and then they really stepped in and supported us with stuff that we weren't mature enough or were having difficulty with. These are just some of those family practices, thinking about how your parents raised you, your family rules, their discipline styles, their types of punishment or rewards, methods to deal with conflict, decision-making power, in the family communication styles, the amount of affection and nurturing practices. What type of rituals and routines did your family have? and what was their involvement in your schooling and your education. All of these things shaped you significantly in some way or another. And maybe they, like, for example, for me, the first thing that comes to my mind is I am incredibly forward thinking, and I'm really good at reflecting on the past and thinking about the future. So something as simple as like the highs and lows of the week probably really shaped my personality. My parents were also very into like personal growth at the time when I was young and impressionable. And so I think those things had a huge impact on the way that I think about the world, the way I think about myself and my identity. And so if you are a parent, and I'm going through these different styles, and even if you're not, I want you to think about, one, what parenting style do your parents most resemble? For me, it was authoritative. And then, well, how did that impact you? And how did that shape you into who you are? And and then the third question, if you're becoming a parent, is what kind of parenting style do you think is the most effective? Gentle parenting, that's like the new fad that really does fall into authoritative parenting. I think a lot of people misunderstand it, and they think it's permissive indulgent because of that low control. If we're gentle parenting our kids, we don't have that high level of boundaries, which is not true. Gentle parenting actually has a ton of boundaries and accountability. It's all in the way that you communicate them, the tone of voice, the level of voice you use, the way that you approach setting these boundaries. And a lot of parents struggle with that. And so they misuse the concept of gentle parenting to be more permissive indulgent. And so it's a really important distinction to make, is that gentle parenting, when done correctly, is actually authoritative parenting style. I also think it's important, as you're reflecting on your own experience with parenting style, I obviously, because I was raised with an authoritative parenting style, I gravitate to this, both in my professional and personal life. When I think the parenting style that personally gives me like the most frustration is permissive in general, but permissive indulgent. And I'll explain why. Technically, I guess if you were asking my opinion, permissive neglectful is objectively worse than permissive indulgent because it's just neglectful. There's no warmth. At least with permissive indulgent, there's some level of warmth. However, it infuriates me more than any of the other parenting styles because usually those are the parents with the most potential for change and the most potential to be actually an authoritative parent. And so I believe, and the research does support, that authoritative parenting is the most effective. When they've done research on the other types of parenting, and again, some of these studies are biased because mostly white people were sampled. So just take note that I'm acknowledging this. But the research does say that, for example, the authoritarian parenting style leads to less successful child outcomes. Children raised in authoritarian homes tend to be more anxious, they tend to be more insecure, they tend to have lower self-esteem and poor communication skills, they tend to be overly aggressive. They may show little independence and have acting out behaviors, they may have poor social problem-solving skills. It also correlates highly with poor school performance and teacher reports of adjustment problems to school. Children of authoritarian families tend to avoid challenging academic situations and seek easy success. I also think that children of authoritarian, this is just, again, I'm going to insert my opinion. It is my podcast after all. They're sneakier and they are more apt to lie and deceive than be truthful and open and honest, and that can impact their relationships. We talk about the permissive parenting. The permissive or indulgent and permissive or neglectful parenting styles also are associated with negative child well-being outcomes. Children of both indulgent and neglectful families tend to have poor social skills and lack self-control. Indulgent parenting may lead children who are disrespectful and non-compliant and who have difficulty setting goals or handling responsibilities. I think this is a lot of what we see now. I think we're seeing a huge insurgence of indulgent parenting going on. Children of neglectful families tend to lack self-esteem and be at high risk for emotional and behavioral problems, including alcohol and substance abuse. I think we saw this a lot more in the 60s, 50s, 60s, 70s. Researchers have also found that the authoritarian and permissive parenting styles are correlated with children being motivated by extrinsic rewards as opposed to being intrinsically motivated to learn. Authoritative families, on the other hand, are associated with a lot of positive outcomes. Children of authoritative families tend to be independent, self-reliant, responsible. They also have pro-social behaviors such as cooperation, sharing, and sympathy for others. Adolescents raised by authoritative families were less involved in drug or delinquent activities and had higher grades than other children, and their families were more likely to be involved in school and their children's academic work. Researchers have theorized that authoritative parenting styles do lead to positive school outcomes because authoritative families provide their children with a high level of emotional security, which helps them succeed in school. Authoritative families also provide children with explanations for their actions and opportunities for two-way communication, which helps children develop strong interpersonal skills. I think the mistake of authoritative versus authoritarian parenting styles is that authoritarian parents rob the children of developing problem-solving skills and communication skills. So if you are engaging in dialogue with your child about the why and explaining why you're doing things and why it's important, your child is not only learning that and absorbing that, but they're also learning how to dialogue with you back and forth, and that's a really important skill. So authoritarian parents, when they just say, do as I say, get in line and shut up, they're robbing their child of that. And the permissive and neglectful and indulgent parents also rob their children of that because they're either just indulging their child in whatever they want and not engaging them in that social problem-solving process, or they're just neglecting their child and not engaging in relationship building at all. So, again, I said in the beginning of the episode, don't think of one or the other as bad. Clearly, the research does support that authoritative parenting is the more positively associated outcomes with parenting. However, there are cultural nuances to this. There are cultural nuances in the way that people speak to one another, the way that they interpret behavior, tones of voice might be interpreted differently. Nonverbal behaviors may interpret it differently. There is a theory that like 80% of behavior is interpreted through nonverbal behaviors. So different cultures have different interpretations of nonverbal behavior that, like, from a white American person perspective, might fall into authoritarian parenting style with the tone of voice and the way they speak, but really it's authoritative for that particular social group. So I think that's what I'm trying to say, is that there is nuance to this. It's not just, oh, this is good or this is bad, but I think it's just opening our minds to different people do things differently, and that's okay, as long as we are sharing the same shared desire to develop well-adjusted, healthy, well-rounded human beings. That's really the goal, right? And so if you are going down this road of parenting, or you aspire to become a parent, really engage thoughtfully and intentionally in the way that, and the style of which you parent. And if you're not choosing to become a parent, or that's not in your mind at this time in your life, it's really can potentially be really healing to also understand the way in which you were parented and how that could have impacted the way that you show up in the world. If you were parented in an authoritarian parenting style and you really struggle with authority, if you really struggle with being open and honest, if you really struggle with self-esteem, if you really struggle with some of those things, that can really help provide you some clarity of where to go next. Where to go next would mean really sorting things out through therapy and really teasing apart how you can heal those parts of yourself so that you can become your most integrated, authentic self. None of those things, the parenting style in which your parents parented you is not your fault. It was something that was determined before you were born. And your parents are also products of how they were parented and so on and so forth. So I think also having a lot of compassion for your parents and that they also were, I don't know. I don't really know if I believe that every parent does their best, but I believe that every parent is living in some type of reality of their own suffering or their own lack of healing if they are struggling to parent. If you are a product of a parent that really struggled parenting, they probably weren't struggling to parent intentionally, is what I'm saying. But I do believe that people at this point, with all the access to technology and training and support out there, know better, but they don't necessarily do better. And so but I think you can still have compassion for your parents, is my point, because we're all doing our best for this self-preservation aspect. And, it's something I was just talking with my own parents about today, actually, before I recorded this, about the whole concept of self-preservation. And sometimes we do project our own stuff onto other people. And you know what, when this happens the most? Parents to their kids. By far. So if your parents projected and they were a permissive parent or a authoritarian parent and you have resentment for that, you can both have compassion that they probably were functioning in a way that was self-preservation for their own survival. And you also owe it to yourself to heal those parts of yourself so that you can become an integrated, authentic, happy, healed version of you. I hope you enjoyed this episode and it got you thinking about parenting styles and what parenting style you were raised with and what you aspire to be as a parent yourself. Definitely DM me, comment, etc., and share with me your thoughts about this. And do you think that Diana Baumrind is absolutely off her rocker? Do you agree? Do you like this? Do you think that categories suck and we need to stop putting people in boxes? What do you think? I will be back next week with a guest, and I'm excited for that. And I just am excited that this season has been so fun and so thought-provoking, like I was saying. And I will be back next week with the next installment of The B Word. That's all for this episode of The B Word. Don't forget to check out the show notes for any resources we shared with you today, as well as finding our links to our Instagram, Facebook, YouTube channel, and our website, bucommunity.com. You can find out all of our course offerings, memberships, opportunities to work with me individually, and more. That's all for now. See you next time.